Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War 2 Retribution for PC. This is the second standalone expansion pack to Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War 2. It was developed by Relic Entertainment and published originally by THQ in March of 2011, but it later got picked up by Sega once THQ went under. And it's actually kind of interesting because, first off, they ditched Games for Windows Live with this one, so this ran entirely on Steam and was just way better as a result in terms of its online connectivity, in terms of its stability, all sorts of things like that. And so that was just greatly appreciated to begin with. And thus, a lot more people tended to play Retribution's multiplayer than did the previous two games, just by nature of it actually working. And this is also pretty much the point where Relic kind of became obsessed with DLC. Now, admittedly, most of that is cosmetic, like, for example, the Ultramarines pack, where it's basically just a pack of Ultramarine skins for the Space Marines, or the Death Corps of Krieg, which is pretty awesome, and things like that. And I'm perfectly okay with that, and most people are perfectly okay with that. But they also threw in things like War Gear DLC, which is for the Last Stand mode, and they threw in the Tau Commander for the Last Stand mode being at a full $10. So the DLC practices for this thing are a bit iffy, but how is the game overall anyway? Is it a worthy successor to the previous two games, and does it handling things a bit differently actually change things up in the long run, or what? Now, there's really not all that much to talk about in terms of presentation compared to the previous two editions, both Dawn of War 2 and Chaos Rising. Why? Because it looks pretty much exactly the same as those quality-wise. There was a lot of asset reuse, and it was basically just tightened up to make sure there weren't any glitches or anything like that, and they added in the new content, namely the Imperial Guard faction. And it works out pretty well in the game's favor because, again, the original Dawn of War 2 and Chaos Rising both look really good for what they are, and it all manages to capture that Warhammer 40k vibe really well. Same goes for the sound design. You still have that fantastic, sweeping, epic score, as well as the ridiculously over-the-top and just awesome voice acting. And they did redo some of the voices here and there, but it all is well in keeping with the Warhammer 40k vibe and is all very welcome. Basically, they just tightened up a few voices here and there and not much else. So it's all going to be very familiar to you if you played the previous two Dawn of War 2 editions. And it's all very, very high quality. So it really falls down to the story and the gameplay to determine whether or not this is worth picking up. And the story in this takes place 10 years after the events of Chaos Rising. And once again, you're on Subsector Aurelia, and the sector is dealing with Orc invasions and Chaos invasions and Eldar and Tyranids, all sorts of things that are just really nasty and very unpleasant to deal with. And so the Imperial Inquisition decides, you know what? This is beyond saving. We're just going to order an Exterminatus. Now, if you don't know what an Exterminatus is, it's basically glassing every single habitable planet in the system. Or for those of you who are not familiar with that term, basically they pound the planets with orbital bombardment until there's basically nothing left on the planet except cracked ruins. And so what you end up having is this situation where you can play as a variety of different factions. Namely, of course, the Imperial Guard, who are the new additions to the game. But you can also take control of Space Marines, Chaos, Eldar, Orcs, or the Tyranids. And each of them have their own storylines that all intertwine on this subsector. For example, the Inquisitor goes in to try to figure out what the hell's going on in the first place before the Exterminatus arrives, and see if there's anything worth salvaging. She's joined by the 8th Cadian Regiment, led by Lord General Castor, and they end up getting involved in the investigation into Chapter Master Azariah Kyrus, who is the head of the Blood Ravens at the time, and is heavily suspected of being involved with Chaos. Spoiler alert, he is. Except that really isn't much of a spoiler, because you pretty much knew that going into this thing. Well, that and the storytelling in this game isn't exactly the best, so it's pretty obvious right from the start. But that's beside the point. As far as the Space Marine campaign goes, you're basically fighting off the hordes of Chaos led by Eliphas the Inheritor, and you're trying to also investigate Chapter Master Kyrus and his connection to Chaos. The Tyranids are basically just there to do Tyranid things to consume the worlds of Subsector Aurelia in order to create more of their kind, which is basically all they do anyway. Chaos is there to just basically be chaos. The orcs are there just to fight and try to win as best they can against these enemies that are supposed to be the best. At least they think anyway. And then there's the Eldar, who just show up looking for an artifact, but then get caught up in this huge conflict between all these various factions and just kind of get stuck with fighting people. And of course they don't like chaos either, so that doesn't help, so they're of course going to fight them. But the story itself is just really weak, and you don't really give a crap about it. None of the characters are particularly good. They have decent portrayals, and some of them are just so laughably over the top you gotta love it. But at the same time, they're all pretty much one-dimensional, and they never really grow over time. The plot is never really interesting to begin with, so you don't really give a crap about it. And it really falls to the gameplay to try to bring things up. And what you find there is decidedly different from what you saw in Dawn of War 2 and Chaos Rising. In those, you had a handful of units that you would just bring around from mission to mission, and you'd upgrade them over time with better war gear and such like that. In Retribution, it takes a bit more of a traditional RTS approach, where you have a few hero units that you do take between missions, and they do get more powerful when you're playing the game over time, but they're just individual units or very small squads like Lord General's retinue, which is basically just the Lord General and 2 stormtroopers, and you can add people to it over time, but that's kinda it. And you find that the real backbone of your army is going to actually be units that you produce during the game, where you find these various locations and you just start training units. And over time you can, of course, get better and better units. You can get better and better equipment for those units by just clicking the little upgrade things in the interface. And it becomes very, very clear, just from playing the single player for even a few minutes, that the game is really not centered around a campaign, but rather skirmish mode. Now that's not to say that the campaigns are bad. They're certainly playable, and if you like this sort of thing, you can certainly get some enjoyment out of them. They're just really lackluster, and that's mostly because it really does feel like these were just skirmish matches that they decided to throw together and say, okay, well, now we need to make it a campaign. Well, let's just make it so they have to go up this linear path and throw in a few event triggers here and there. Okay, it must be a campaign mission. So it feels lazy, actually. And so you feel like you'd just be better served actually playing the straight-up skirmish mode, which is where the game really shines. It's basically the same kind of idea from the previous 2 editions of Dawn of War 2, but with all the content from the previous ones and some new content of its own, with new units and just different maps, things like that. And it's all very well polished and pretty fun to play, although it can turn into a bit of a slog sometimes if you just go for the annihilation victory condition, where you basically just have to completely destroy the enemy's base and all of its units in order to win. And that can get kind of tiresome, but if you go for victory points and you decide that you want to play it in multiplayer, you're going to have a really intense RTS match. It's really more of a tactics game at this point, though, because there is only one building that you're training units at, and so what you end up having is this race to control all of the requisition points and the power nodes and such like that in order to quickly get all of your forces built up. And if you're the Imperial Guard, that's a really big deal, because the Imperial Guard really only shines once they get their vehicles in. They can do okay with just their infantry, but let's face it, who needs infantry when you've got a Bane Blade, which is just glorious, and it completely demolishes just about anything on the battlefield. Now, of course, with something that powerful on the battlefield, of course the other factions have ways of countering it and actually being able to bring it down. It's just kind of difficult. And once you finally get to the stage where you're having actual Baneblade battles, you're going to find that it's really where it becomes a slog, because by that point you're mostly in the late stages of Annihilation mode, and it's just kind of this endless back and forth where nothing is really accomplished. So you hope not to get to that stage, but if you do manage to get a Baneblade earlier, then you can pretty much just steamroll the opposition. And so working toward that is actually a pretty big strategy if you're playing as Imperial Guard. Now the other factions each have their own play styles as well, and those mostly stem from the previous games rather than this particular edition. But you do have different ways of playing depending on what faction you're playing, and each of those has 3 different ways depending on what hero you decide to choose, whether you want the offense, defense, or the basically support. And while it doesn't really change your units themselves, it does add some interesting dynamics to the game where you can have your hero doing these incredibly powerful abilities to really help out your forces in different ways. And so if you decide to play the defensive one, for example, more likely than not, you're going to end up setting up these defensive lines where you just position your units to defend the various points. And that's really where I feel the Imperial Guard shines, because they get access to a lot of turrets and such like that, so they're really built for defense right from the start. And a tactic I've found that works pretty well is if you play Imperial Guard as a really defensive faction and have your teammate playing as some other faction that's particularly good at offense, and basically just use the Imperial Guard as a shield for them to hide behind while they go off and try to take out targeted strikes on things. And that brings up a pretty big point. This game really shines in its multiplayer, not so much its single player. And the simple reason for that is the AI is not very good. Whether you're playing it solo against hard NPCs or playing with an AI teammate against other AI, it becomes very, very obvious. And you'll be seeing it in this video because it's just easier for me to record against the computer. But you'll be seeing that they're basically not much more than a nuisance to a player. And so when you actually get a bunch of other players in there, that's when things get interesting. And it really does scream that this was built for multiplayer, not just from this, but also the emphasis on the last stand mode. Now this is something that got added into Dawn of War 2 in one of the patches. And it was basically just this mode where you could get up to 2 other people together, and you were all playing hero characters from the various factions, and you could just fend off hordes and hordes and hordes of enemies. And you got war gear to equip to your characters, and they leveled up over time and such like that. It's kind of a neat diversion, but it wasn't really refined up until Retribution, where they clearly put quite a bit of emphasis on it. It just feels a lot more fleshed out, even though it's a very simple mode with only 2 maps and a handful of characters to play as. Now, like I said, you can get the Tau Commander for $10 as a DLC, but apart from that, you're having different heroes from all the factions. For example, the Imperial Guard hero is the Lord General, or the Space Marines have the Space Marine Captain, or the Eldar have a Farseer, and things like that. And each of them, again, have their own abilities. You can get war gear to equip to them, and it's a neat mode to have a bit of a diversion from, but it doesn't really feel like Dawn of War. And it's kind of interesting that they actually took this mode entirely out of the game to some degree. I mean, it's still in there, don't get me wrong, but they made it its own thing. There is a bit called the last standalone, where it's just the last stand mode as a standalone game. And I think that's where they really acknowledge that people like that, but it's not really Warhammer 40k Dawn of War 2, so to speak. It's just kind of its own thing. And when they put quite a bit of emphasis on it, it kind of makes you wonder why they didn't just separate it from the main game sooner. And in this particular case, while it is a decent diversion from time to time, it's not something I keep going back to Retribution for. I go back to it because of the skirmish mode, which is just really fun to play. And so what you end up having is basically a refinement of some of the ideas from the previous 2 Dawn of War 2 editions. And it's all brought together in a package that uses Steam as its DRM and uses Steamworks for all the multiplayer mechanics and everything like that, so it ends up actually functioning as opposed to the Games for Windows Live plague that was in Dawn of War 2 and Chaos Rising. And so that's why Retribution ended up being kind of enduring compared to those 2, whereas those 2 just kind of shot off the radar fairly quickly. Because let's face it, nobody likes Games for Windows Live. Not even Microsoft likes it. So when you get to the situation where they're like, okay, well, we're going to make it on Steam, everybody was all for it. And I think that's why people tend to overlook a lot of its issues. And honestly, it's actually fairly easy to overlook those issues even if you're not looking at it from a, oh well, it actually functions standpoint. Because it is a very well polished, well refined, very fun to play RTS that is different from most other games out there, and is just a refinement of what you saw in Dawn of War 2 and Chaos Rising. I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.